for a cup downstairs. And it might seem kind of, but I've never really looked in the cabinets downstairs. So I'm searching for a cup, just a cup, any cup. So I finally see one with no handle, so it looks almost like maybe it was a vase, I don't know, but I take it, and I happen to look at the bottom. It's just a thing my dad taught me to do years ago. Look at the bottom of any glassware, right? Made in Germany. I thought, right? What are the chances of that? I'm just looking for a cup, and made in Germany, so I just had to share that with you. Anyway, before we delve into the gospel lesson for today, I want to take a brief look at what Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 13. He said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if that salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men." So, why is Jesus comparing us as human beings to salt that is mined from the earth? You see, in the ancient world, sometimes we forget, salt was a valuable and scarce commodity. Not like today where we have that little Morton Girls salt, the blue wrappered salt in every household, or pink Himalayan salt now seems to be the thing, or nondescript generic salt. We need to remember that people in ancient times, they didn't have refrigerators or freezers to put that block of ice in, even back then, right? Salt was necessary to preserve the food. With salt, they preserved vegetables and fish. Because food was preserved by salt, food was naturally seasoned by salt. Well, the implication is that just as food could be bland and go bad without salt, the believer can be bland and perhaps ineffective without the seasoning of living their faith. A seasoned disciple can make a difference, whereas those without seasoning are really no use to anyone. Those who claim to be believers but make no life changes that indicate that they're followers. So what does this mean to be a seasoned, salted disciple? Well, maybe it can be best expressed by a legendary story. Legend has it that a missionary was swept overboard while traveling on the high seas, and subsequently was washed up on a beach at the edge of a remote village. Nearly dead from exposure and lack of food and fresh water, he was found by the people of that village, and he was nursed back to health. He lived among them for 20 years, quietly adapting to their culture and working alongside of them. He preached no sermons. He made no personal faith claim. Neither did he read scripture to them. But when the people were sick, he sat with them, sometimes all night. When people were hungry, he prepared what he could for them. When they were lonely, he visited them. Sounds like another part of the Gospel of Matthew, doesn't it? He taught the uneducated and always took the side of those who had been wronged. Well, a day came when some missionaries entered that same village, and they began talking to them, preaching to them about a man named Jesus. After listening a while to their story, the native people insisted, "Jesus has lived here for the past 20 years. Come," he said, "we'll introduce you to him. It sounds like you've been looking for him." The missionaries were led to a hut where they found their long-lost companion. You see, this missionary was a seasoned disciple, adapting to the culture, respecting others' beliefs, not considering himself better than the community he became a part of. His very nature was salt. He gave of himself to others in real and tangible ways, and enhancing the flavor of their lives just by living and moving and having his being in God. He was living a non-dualistic way of life. He didn't see his cultural norm as better than, or as his is good and theirs is bad. He embraced both cultures, what he once knew and what he came to know. Wouldn't it be great if all of us, well, I think it would be, if we could all take a class on world religions? We live in a nation that is becoming more and more diverse, and it's important that we try to understand people who have different backgrounds than us, whether religious and just a different cultural experience than us. In studying world religions in seminary, I remember being so surprised to find the similarities in the religions. The basic core of most faiths is love. Love of God, love of others, love of self, no matter what their name is for God. This missionary worked alongside of people who took him in. He didn't try to change them to be like him. He didn't judge them. He got to know them and got to know their ways. He got involved in their lives. He accepted them for who they were, right where they were. So now, we're going to look at the gospel text from Mark, but I first am going to summarize what took place right before this scripture that Kirk read. Okay? Starting in verse 14, we hear of a man coming to Jesus and saying, Jesus, my son has demons, possessed by an evil spirit, and your disciples couldn't get it out of him. And he tells, and I am paraphrasing a lot here, he says to the man, first he says, "Oh, unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you?" Then he tells the man, "Bring the boy here," and Jesus has the unclean spirit go out of him. Right after that, we read, the disciples began arguing with one another of who was the greatest among them. Can you believe that? They just messed it up, right? They just, not messed it up, but, their faith wasn't quite where it needed to be to do what they thought they could do. But now they're arguing about who's better. A better what? A better disciple? A better person? A better, I don't know, but they were arguing. And they knew that it was wrong for them to argue, because when Jesus said to them, "What are you arguing about? What were you arguing about back there?" They didn't say anything. Oh, nothing. They knew it. They must have been so. Okay, then we get to this place where we did hear Kirk read today. We get to this place where they witnessed someone casting out demons, and they were successful at it. How do you think that made the disciples feel? Oh, angry, jealous, right? They're not with us. They tell Jesus, we told them to stop. They're not one of us. Jesus says, don't stop them. After that, he says, whoever is not against us is for us. He continues to say, I tell you the truth, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to Christ will certainly not lose any reward. And then he goes on to say some things that seem a little harsh. If any of you cause one of these little ones who believe in me to sin or stumble, it would be better if a great millstone was put around your neck and over you go. Or if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Who is this man? Right? What does Jesus mean by this? Well, just like different words in the Greek language, like there's 3 different words for love in the Greek language. I'm sure you've heard, a lot of you have heard that before. Right? There's phileo, a brotherly love, eros, like a romantic love, and agape, which is the love God like has for us that we have for God. Well, this story, there's different words for sin as well in the Greek language. This story is shaped by the meaning of a word called scandalizo or scandala, which is Greek for causing to sin. Causing to sin. The NIV uses the word sin, the NRSV uses stumble. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your foot causes you to stumble. Now, scandala is translated, interestingly enough, as a stumbling stone or a stumbling block. That's familiar to us, right? It's the word we get our English word scandalized from, which means, right, we become outraged. Oh, what a scandal. We're outraged and offended. But in ancient times, the scandalon was a stone that a person stumbled on and then cursed. Come on, don't tell me you've never done that. Stub your toe. Ah! Right? Okay. So Jesus is saying, whatever causes you to be outraged or offended, that makes you want to curse, let it go. Discard it. He is not, of course, talking about body parts, people. Okay? And also, he is not talking about issues of injustice, where we have the right to be angry and offended. There is such a thing as righteous anger, right? So we're not talking about that either. But he's saying we need to avoid being offended by other people who take different approaches to the faith tradition than ourselves. Because they're not one of our group, they don't seem our same-mindedness, we can welcome things done out of love, even if we don't agree with it. God knows the intention, right? We're not judged. We're not to be judged. Well, it's an important word, I think, in our time of when church communities are being divided by being offended by certain positions. The big topics: abortion, homosexuality, roles of women in the church. It wasn't too long ago that was a big one. In fact, I do want to share a story with you that might make this a little clearer with what I'm trying to get across. I always think stories can help with that. So, Sue, you heard this week, so you're going to hear it again. So, can you hear me if I step away? Can you still hear me okay? Okay. So, years ago, I don't know how long, but years ago, I was an associate pastor of a larger church, Methodist church, and I became friends with people of a local Baptist church, and we would play music together. We were in a praise team. And so anyway, one of the women invited me to come and speak at a seminar that she was having, a woman's day, right? And she wanted me to talk to them and use music and be with them for the day. And I was like, I would love to do that. So they had a topic, and I was building things around the topic. And about 2 weeks before, she called, and she didn't sound like herself. She's like, Deb, I have to tell you something. I have to ask you something. I'm like, okay. She said, my pastor, I told him, you were coming to talk to the women's group, and he was like, oh, well, he said, I guess it's okay, as long as she doesn't get behind the pulpit. Now, this is only maybe 10 years ago. 10 years ago. Now that particular type of Baptist church, right, I'm not, this is not to, that's what they believed. Okay, women were not pastors. Women were not leaders in the church unless they were leading a women's group. So, now she said, will you still come? I said, yeah, I wasn't going to be behind the pulpit anyway. To be honest, I'd be down with you on the floor, like being close with the people. So, but the example I want to give is, I could have went the other route. And in my humanness, there's been times I'm sure I've gone the other route. I went to seminary, I had my MDiv, I'm a Methodist pastor over here, and given all the reasons of why I should be angry of their difference. That's what this story is about. Right? Don't let something cause you to stumble in your ministry, in what God is leading you to do. Don't get angry about something that causes you then not to do it, just because there's a difference. That's what I believe. That's my interpretation of this scripture, and some other people. I do read commentaries and things. So, but that is kind of how I understand it. Don't let the differences get in the way of your ministry. According to Jesus, we should take strong steps to avoid being offended by others that are not one of us. John and the other disciples were offended when they saw this man casting out demons. I'm sure they were jealous, because they just couldn't do it themselves 3 paragraphs before that, right? And they wanted to stop him. Jesus said, no, don't stop him. Then he goes on to explain what we should do in order not to be offended by other people, how we're to deal with people that are other than us, but basically doing the same work if it's out of love. And we're not always going to know if it's out of love, but that's not our job to know. That's God's job. Jesus' concluding words are directed at this phenomenon. Everyone will be salted with fire, meaning we will be tested for our own saltiness. Jesus said salt is good, and if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Then he says this, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. In other words, we're not to judge, but each of us will be accountable in the end by our own saltiness, our own seasoning of living our faith. On this World Communion Sunday, when we share at the Lord's table with those around the globe, people with different ethnicities, languages, and cultures, people with different governmental systems and economic climates, some extremely wealthy, some extremely poor, but we all worship the same God. So as we come around the table, let us remember Jesus' words. Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another.